Gong Yoo is not the kind of actor who feels like he is chasing the camera. He feels like someone the camera keeps chasing anyway. Born Gong Cheol on July 10, 1979, in Busan, he began acting in the early 2000s and eventually became one of Korea's most quietly powerful male stars through works like Coffee Prince, Silenced, Train to Busan, Guardian, The Lonely and Great God, Squid Game, and The Trunk. But what makes Gong Yoo fascinating is not just the list of hits, it is the emotional distance inside them. He has always carried a strange contradiction. On screen, he can feel warm, romantic, protective, even heartbreaking. But beneath that warmth is often a kind of loneliness, as if the man in front of us is present, but never fully available. That is why his image became so magnetic. He does not overwhelm the viewer. He pulls them closer by holding something back. And maybe that is the real secret of Gong Yoo. He became a dream not by giving people everything, but by making them wonder what he was hiding behind his silence. From the boyish charm of Coffee Prince to the tragic immortality of Goblin, from the desperate father in Train to Busan to the unnerving recruiter in Squid Game, Gong Yoo built a career around men who are never as simple as they first appear. He does not just act. He haunts the frame quietly. Before Gong Yoo became the kind of actor whose silence could carry an entire scene, he was simply Gong Cheol, a young man from Busan trying to find his place in front of the camera. He did not arrive as an instant legend. His early career moved gradually through television, hosting, and supporting roles. He studied theater at Kyunghee University, entered entertainment in the early 2000s, and slowly began building recognition through projects like School 4, Hello My Teacher, and One Fine Day. These were not the roles that made him immortal yet, but they mattered because they gave him time to develop something that would later become central to his power: restraint. Gong Yoo's early charm was softer, more youthful, and more accessible than the mythic image people associate with him now. He had warmth. He had ease. He could play the romantic leading man without feeling cold or overly manufactured. But even then, there was something slightly distant in his presence. Not emptiness, but reserve. The feeling that he could smile and still keep a private room inside himself untouched. That quality became important because Gong Yoo was never at his best when he tried to dominate a scene by force. His strength came from tension, from emotional withholding, from the way he could make the audience feel that a character was holding back more than he was saying. That is a subtle skill, and it takes time to sharpen. In the early years, he was still being shaped by the industry. Handsome enough to be noticed, warm enough to be liked, and talented enough to keep moving forward. But the true Gong Yoo image had not fully formed yet. The world had not yet seen the actor who could turn loneliness into atmosphere, regret into romance, and silence into something almost physical. That version of him was still waiting. And then came the role that changed everything, not by making him look bigger, but by making him feel more human than he ever had before. When Coffee Prince aired in 2007, Gong Yoo did not simply become more famous. He became emotionally unforgettable. At first, the drama looked like a romantic comedy built around charm, confusion, and youthful energy. But beneath its playful surface was something more delicate. A story about love, identity, vulnerability, and the fear of wanting someone you do not fully understand. And Gong Yoo's performance as Choi Han-kyul became the emotional center of that tension. What made the role so powerful was not just that he was charming, it was that he allowed confusion to look honest. Han-kyul could have been played as a typical arrogant romantic lead, handsome, childish, and eventually softened by love. But Gong Yoo made him more human than that. He let the character's attraction, frustration, denial, fear, and tenderness unfold with real emotional messiness. The audience could watch him fighting himself, and that made the romance feel more alive. Not perfect, not polished, alive. That was the moment Gong Yoo stopped being only a handsome lead. He became an actor people trusted with emotional contradiction. And that trust mattered, because Coffee Prince did something rare for his image. It gave him warmth without making him simple. It gave him romance without trapping him in shallow fantasy. It made him desirable, yes, but also uncertain, vulnerable, and painfully sincere. That is why the role still lingers years later. People did not only fall for the character, they remembered the emotional risk Gong Yoo allowed him to carry. But the success of Coffee Prince also created a new problem. Once an actor becomes beloved in a role that feels that intimate, the public wants to keep him there. They want the same smile, the same longing, the same emotional accessibility. But Gong Yoo's career would later prove that he was not interested in being preserved as one kind of romantic memory forever. Because after Coffee Prince, his path grew darker, heavier, and far more complicated. He would go on to take roles that confronted trauma, moral responsibility, disaster, loneliness, and even death. And that is what made him different from many actors who become famous through romance. He did not use romance as a final destination. He used it as proof that the audience would follow him into deeper, more difficult places. In other words, Coffee Prince did not define Gong Yoo forever. It opened the door. After Coffee Prince, Gong Yoo could have stayed inside the safest version of his fame, the warm, romantic lead, the charming man with emotional softness, the actor audiences already loved and wanted to keep loving in the same way. But instead, his career began moving toward something heavier. One of the most important turning points came with Silenced in 2011. This was not a project built for easy popularity. It was painful, disturbing, and socially urgent. Based on a real case of abuse at a school for hearing-impaired children, the film forced audiences to confront injustice in a way that went far beyond entertainment. Gong Yoo's involvement gave the story greater visibility, and the public reaction was so powerful that it helped contribute to renewed social and legal attention around the case. That mattered because it changed the meaning of his stardom. He was no longer only the man people wanted to fall in love with on screen. He had become an actor willing to stand inside stories that hurt. That shift gave his image a new layer: responsibility. Gong Yoo's quietness no longer felt only romantic or mysterious. It began to feel moral, like the silence of someone witnessing something unbearable and refusing to look away. Then came Train to Busan in 2016, and his screen identity changed again. As Seok-woo, Gong Yoo played a father who begins the story emotionally distant, distracted, and imperfect. He is not a natural hero at first. He is selfish in small ways, absent in emotional ways, human in uncomfortable ways. But as the world collapses around him, he is forced into transformation. The horror of the film is not just zombies. It is the question of whether a man can become better when there is almost no time left. And Gong Yoo made that transformation devastating. He did not play heroism as glamour. He played it as regret arriving too late, love becoming action, and sacrifice becoming the final language of a man who had failed to say enough when he still had time. That is why Train to Busan hit so hard. It turned Gong Yoo's warmth into grief, his restraint into guilt, his face into the image of a man realizing at the edge of death what love should have been earlier. By this point, Gong Yoo had become far more than a romantic actor. He had become someone who could carry moral weight, someone whose presence could make a story feel not just emotional, but necessary. And that is what made his next transformation even more powerful. Because after carrying social pain and apocalyptic sacrifice, Gong Yoo would step into a role that turned loneliness itself into mythology. Then came Goblin, And suddenly, Gong Yoo was no longer just a beloved actor. He became a myth. As Kim Shin, the immortal goblin cursed to live for centuries, Gong Yoo stepped into a role that seemed almost designed for the emotional architecture he had been building for years. Loneliness, restraint, warmth, regret, romance, and silence. But Goblin did something even bigger than give him another hit drama. It transformed those qualities into fantasy on a massive scale. Kim Shin was not a simple romantic hero. He was a man who had lived too long, loved too late, suffered too quietly, and carried death inside his own body like memory. That is why the role fit Gong Yoo so perfectly. His face already had the kind of melancholy that made silence feel lived in. His warmth never felt childish, his loneliness never felt decorative. So when he played a man cursed with immortality, audiences believed not just the fantasy, but the exhaustion underneath it. That is what made Goblin so powerful. It turned Gong Yoo's distance into desire. The very thing that made him feel slightly unreachable became the center of the romance. He was not the man who could easily belong to someone. He was the man whose love felt impossible because time itself stood between him and happiness. That kind of fantasy is incredibly seductive, but also dangerous for an actor's image. Because once millions of viewers fall in love with you as an impossible man, they begin carrying that impossibility into the way they see you outside the role. And that is the burden. After Goblin, Gong Yoo became even more strongly associated with a kind of male ideal that is almost impossible to live inside. Mature, wounded, protective, elegant, lonely, and emotionally profound. Not just handsome, not just romantic, but mythic. The man who has suffered enough to understand love deeply, but remains distant enough to never feel ordinary. That image is beautiful, but it is also a cage. Because when an actor becomes someone's impossible dream, the public often resists seeing him as ordinary, flawed, or even fully human. Every role afterward carries the shadow of the myth. Every public appearance is measured against the fantasy. Every absence becomes part of the mystery. And perhaps Gong Yoo understood that danger better than anyone. Instead of flooding the industry after Goblin, he became even more selective. His later appearances, including his unsettling role in Squid Game and his work in The Trunk, did not simply repeat the romantic fantasy. They complicated it. They reminded the audience that Gong Yoo is not only warmth and longing, he can also be strange, cold, dangerous, and emotionally unreadable. That is what keeps his career alive. He allows the dream to exist, but never lets it fully own him. Today, Gong Yoo feels less like an actor constantly trying to stay visible, and more like a presence the public waits for. That is a rare kind of power. He does not need endless projects to remain relevant. He does not need to appear everywhere, explain everything, or keep proving that people still care. His absence has become part of his image. The less he gives away, the more the audience seems to wonder. And that mystery is one of the reasons Gong Yoo has lasted so long. From Coffee Prince to Silenced, from Train to Busan to Goblin, from Squid Game to The Trunk, his career has never been only about charm. It has been about emotional weight. He plays men who carry regret, danger, tenderness, guilt, and loneliness in ways that feel quiet but unforgettable. Maybe that is the final truth about Gong Yoo. He became beloved through warmth, but he became legendary through distance. He understands that not every star needs to be constantly consumed. Some stars grow stronger by staying slightly out of reach. Gong Yoo's power is not only in what he shows, but in what he withholds. The silence, the pauses, the private sadness behind the eyes, the feeling that even when he is fully on screen, there is still something the audience cannot completely touch. And maybe that is why he remains so magnetic. Because Gong Yoo does not simply act like a dream man. He acts like someone who knows dreams are fragile, and that the most unforgettable ones are the ones we never fully wake from.